Today's episode is brought to you by the Daily Gardener Friday newsletter. You can sign up for the newsletter over at thedailygardener.org. Hi there, and welcome to The Daily Gardener, a podcast about garden history and literature. I'm Jennifer Ebling, and today is June 2nd. It was on this day, June 2nd, in 1731, that Martha Washington, the inaugural First Lady of the United States, was born. At Mount Vernon, Martha was in charge of the kitchen garden, and as mistress of the plantation, she was responsible for entertaining guests and planning the evening meal. This meant that a robust kitchen garden was an absolute necessity. And so the kitchen garden is the oldest garden at Mount Vernon. It was installed in 1760, and the grounds have produced edibles now for over 250 years. So while other areas of Mount Vernon have gone through some pretty significant changes, the kitchen garden, or the lower garden, remains primarily unchanged from how it was initially used back when the Washingtons lived there. Now, George and Martha spent a great deal of time away from the estate, and whenever George would send letters back to Mount Vernon, the very last paragraph was usually reserved for instructions from Martha to the gardener about the kitchen garden. Martha would ask about different crops or suggest plantings or ask that seeds be collected. Martha really was a knowledgeable plantswoman, and when it came to the kitchen garden, she was not afraid to make suggestions or changes. Martha knew that the kitchen garden was a reflection on her as the wife of the president. And when George and Martha were at Mount Vernon, they hosted an average of 600 guests every single year. And most of those folks enjoyed supper at the plantation with the first family. And the meal, no doubt, featured produce from the kitchen garden. Now, a man named William Spencer was the gardener at Mount Vernon. He continued working at Mount Vernon after George Washington died, and he was also a witness to Martha Washington's final wishes. He signed her will on September 22nd, 1800. And now here's a little kismet between Martha Washington's birthday and our second story for today. It was on this day, June 2nd, in 1874, that Pamela Cunningham, the founder of the MVLA, gave her farewell address. Well, the MVLA stands for the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, which was founded back in 1853. And in 1858, 5 years later, this group of indomitable women purchased Mount Vernon from George Washington's descendants. And by so doing, they saved Mount Vernon from development or destruction. Well, together with encouragement from tourists, the MVLA worked to restore the home and the grounds to their former glory. And so it was on this day, June 2nd, back in 1874, that Anne spoke of the need for continued work and guardianship of Mount Vernon. She said, "Ladies, the home of Washington is in your charge. See to it that you keep it the home of Washington. Let no irreverent hand change it. Let no vandal hands desecrate it with the fingers of progress." Well, today we can say definitively that Anne's advice was followed. Washington's home is in top condition, along with the outbuildings and the grounds. And the greenhouse, which was in a fire in 1835, was fully restored in 1952. When it came to Mount Vernon, George Washington always dreamed of a fine landscape and beautiful gardens. Many enslaved people and trained gardeners made his dream a reality. George hired his first gardener in 1762, and a decade later, he posted an ad that ended with these words: A good kitchen gardener is what I want. Well, after seeing the greenhouse that was at Mount Clair in Baltimore, George decided that Mount Vernon also needed a greenhouse. And the owner of Mount Clair not only sent the plans for the greenhouse that they had built there, but she also sent some plants to help the Washingtons christen their greenhouse. And in 1799, a visitor to Mount Vernon wrote, "There I saw English grapes, oranges, limes, and lemons, as well as a variety of plants and flowers, exquisite in their perfume and delightful to the eye." And it was on this day, June 2nd, in 1893, that a witty, thoughtful, and upright citizen of South Yarmouth in Massachusetts, Stephen Sears, wrote in his journal about his garden. Stephen kept a diary for posterity, and nature entries are sprinkled throughout his writings, in between notes on work, worship, and family. Stephen was a Sunday school teacher, and he wrote that he thought it was the best thing he could do for the coming generation. But on this day, June 2nd, in 1893, Stephen was 71 years old, and on this day, he wrote that he had built a cage around a tree and had burned caterpillars. Well, he must have thought them destructive. Maybe they were tent caterpillars. Who knows? But that spring, Stephen had plowed the garden and planted peas. On June 6th, he noted that summer is here, hot and dry. And then he transplanted his tomato vines and hoed his watermelons. Almost every day, Stephen worked in his garden. He watered every single day by hand, and he occasionally added seaweed as a fertilizer. And on June 17th, after 3 weeks of no precipitation, it finally rained. Stephen wrote, "The ground is wet again, and vegetation smiles." Well, at the end of the month, Stephen was clearly frustrated with one particular garden pest, potato bugs. Stephen wrote, "If I were to offer a sacrifice to the devil, it would be potato bugs in lager beer." And it was on this day, June 2nd, in 2003, that an Iraqi scientist named Mahdi Obeidi led U.S. officials, including David Kay, out to his rose garden. Over a decade earlier, in February of 1992, Uday Hussein had told Mahdi to hide all evidence of Iraq's efforts to pursue a nuclear program. And so Mahdi gathered up his documents and prototypes and packed them in a 50-gallon drum. Then Mahdi buried the drum beneath a lotus tree that was surrounded by roses. And the entire stash remained there undisturbed until America declared war on Iraq. Well, Mahdi's story became a book called The Bomb in My Garden, and it tells how Saddam Hussein pursued nukes only to be thwarted by his invasion of Kuwait and by honorable people in his government. And it was only after the fall of Baghdad that Mahdi felt it was finally safe to reveal the secret that he had buried in his garden, under a lotus tree, no less. Well, lotus trees have a long history, and they're known scientifically as the Sisyphus lotus. And in Greek mythology, in the Odyssey, it was the lotus tree fruit that was eaten by the lotus eaters to make them sleepy and to create a false sense of peace and apathy. It was said that Romulus planted a sacred lotus near the Temple of Vulcan, and that it was still standing 7 centuries later in the time of Pliny the Elder. And the English explorer Richard Francis Burton saw a lotus in his travels through the Middle East. The lotus leaves were used to wash the bodies of the dead, and the fruit was sold to travelers as a cash crop. Today, the lotus tree is used mainly as fodder or for hedges. The thorny branches create an effective barrier, and it's worth noting that the lotus tree flowers are a favorite with pollinators of all kinds. It's time to grow that garden library with today's book, Where We Bloom by Deborah Prinzing. This book came out in 2022, and the very long subtitle is this, and I'm going to see if I can get it all in one take. 37 intimate, inventive, and artistic studio spaces where floral passions find a place to bloom. And the publisher writes this about Deborah Prinzing's latest book. Step inside the places where flowers come to life. Deborah Prinzing's new book showcases the beautiful plant and flower-filled settings of slow flower designers, farmer florists, and growers, offering great ideas to inspire design, organization, and functionality of your creative studio. And then it says, visit their spaces and read all about their floral passions. Well, in this book, Deborah profiles 37 studio spaces for floral aficionados of all kinds. And I thought you would get a kick out of hearing just one little snippet from one of the studios. This one is Lori Polisky's Woodinville, Washington Modern Homestead. And the space that she's creating in is part of a horse barn that's been converted into a studio with function and beauty in mind. Here's what Deborah wrote. Lori Polisky was a gardener long before she formed Flori, her design studio based in a suburb of Seattle. Lori has made posies and arrangements since she was 5, drawing from roots that began on a family farm in New Jersey where her mother grew lilacs, peonies, and roses. In 2017, Lori formalized a business, and she named her studio Flori, and it rhymes with Lori, and I love that. And she got that Flori term, that word, from the Latin word floris, which means flower. Lori said, "My husband designed my first business card, and it read, Garden-style bowers for small weddings and events." Well, the frustration of producing wedding flowers in a garage that was filled with sports equipment and bicycles inspired dreams of having a dedicated design space. And so Lori's solution was this 12 by 24 foot covered storage area that's on one end of a horse barn where 3 animals are also stabled. And so the space now has 2 sets of white French doors and windows, and they look absolutely charming against the blue-gray shingle siding, complete with striped awning. It's just cute as a bug's ear, as they say. Well, I can only imagine how fun it was for Deborah to roam the country scouting these 37 flower-filled locations for her book. And all the stories and the people behind these magical spaces are a true joy to discover. So if you're thinking about creating or redoing a floral space of your own, whether it's simply a she shed or a little corner of the garage or attic, or if you have a full-on business, well, then you'll find plenty of inspiration in the spaces that are profiled in this book. This book is 127 pages of pure eye candy and dreams made real for modern floral artists and creatives. You can get a copy of Where We Bloom by Deborah Prinzing and support the show using the Amazon link in today's show notes for around $9. And that's a steal. Finally, we end the show today with a celebration of the life of Vita Sackville West. It was on this day, June 2nd, in 1962, that Vita Sackville West, the English author and garden designer, passed away. 2 years earlier, Vita was writing about her marriage to Harold and death. She wrote, "In our advancing age, we love each other more deeply than ever, and also more agonizingly, since we see the inevitable end. It is not nice to know that one of us must die before the other." Well, now we know that Vita died first, and 3 weeks later, Harold wrote in his diary, "Oh, Vita, I have wept buckets for you. Vida Sackville-West was a talented and complex woman. She found success as a poet and a writer and a broadcaster. And after she and Harold purchased Sissinghurst, Vida became one of the most influential gardeners of her time. For over 20 years, Vida and Harold worked together to create a garden where none ever grew before. And all of that experience gave Vida the material that she needed to write a weekly column about her life as a gardener at Sissinghurst for The Observer. And she wrote that column for over a decade. And to her readers, Vida was at once relatable, admirable, witty, and removed. Vida knew love and loss in her personal life, and she had relationships with both men and women. But through it all, Harold remained the true north of her heart. Today, the fruit of their labor and their shared dream, Sissinghurst, is beloved worldwide, and Vida's garden wisdom still holds sway. In her book called The Garden, Vida wrote, "I tried to hold the courage of my ways in that which might endure, daring to find a world in a lost world, a little perfect world." And in her poems, West and East, Vida wrote a loving tribute to Sissinghurst, the place she had created from scratch with Harold, the place of their dreams, and the place that would be their legacy. Here's Vida's poem called The Garden. We owned a garden on a hill. We planted rose and daffodil, flowers that English poets sing, and hoped for glory in the spring. We planted yellow hollyhocks and humble, sweetly smelling stalks, and columbine for carnival, and dreamt of summer's festival. And autumn, not to be outdone, as heiress of the summer sun, should doubly wreathe her tawny head with poppies and with creepers red. We waited then for all to grow. We planted wallflowers in a row, and lavender and borage blue. Alas, we waited, I and you, but love was all that ever grew. Well, that's it for today's show. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. And don't forget that there's no show tomorrow. I'll be celebrating my son's graduation. Really looking forward to that. But we'll get a chance to talk again on Monday. And in the meantime, don't forget that you have a standing invitation to join the free Facebook group for listeners of the show. The next time you're over at Facebook, just search for Daily Gardener Community, where you'd search for a friend and then request to join. And if you'd like more of The Daily Gardener, you can subscribe to the newsletter over at thedailygardener.org. And don't forget that you can also show your support for the show by using the Buy Me a Coffee link over at the website or in today's show notes. This is Jennifer Ebling. Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener. And remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day.